Hey, what's up, guys? John Beaupre, aka Casino Crime, doing another video for you this week. Hey, the last few weeks I've done a live video review of myself playing on America's Card Room, and I thought it was a good idea to go back to doing some groundwork, talking about some theory and doing a hand history review for you today. I might go back to the live video review next time. I actually just got married 2 days ago. Actually, no, 2 days ago. Yeah, right. It was yesterday. And that's just how much I love you guys and how much I love making videos. Day after my wedding, I could be getting ready for the honeymoon, which I'm leaving for tomorrow. But here I am making a video talking about poker. So, but thanks to everybody who watched the last couple of live video reviews and for leaving some feedback in the comments section. And I want you to do the same for this video today. But as you'll see, I have this little sticky note, and I thought it would help kind of highlight the main points that we talk about in each hand history. And speaking of which, if you've watched my other videos, you know that I like to talk about one topic at a time. If we're doing hand history review, I'm typically just going to have them all related to one subject. And today's subject is 4-bet pots. And I think 4-bet pots are really important. A few years ago, all you really needed to know about profiting in 4-bet pots was that people mainly only 3-bet aces. People really only let me back up. Well, people really only 4-bet aces. A couple of years ago, I guess people's ranges were still wider than aces at that time. But, they definitely pretty much only 4-bet aces. And now, games are getting much more aggressive at all the stakes. And you're going to find that 4-betting dynamics have definitely changed. And not just that people are 4-betting wider, but they're also like 3-betting and folding a little bit smarter. And, so all of that taking all of that into consideration, it's important to look for small edges in 4-bet pots. Not to mention that 4-bet pots are they're big pots, so a small mistake can actually cost you a stack, and 1 or 2 stacks a day can certainly destroy your win rate. So it's important to know how to play these situations. I thought it would be easier on you guys if I had this little sticky note in each hand that kind of helped you take notes and highlighted the most important concepts from each hand. So feel free to cheat off them and write them down and anything else that we talk about. I'm going to just cover a few situations that I thought were important. Maybe next week we'll do like a 4-bet, part 2, because I think that there's actually a lot to it. But I just kind of filtered my database for 4-bet pots that I had marked at some other point in time. I don't know when these hands were played, but regardless, I think that they're good for discussion. So here we've got this hand where I opened 3x from the cutoff to 6. This guy in the small blind 3-bets to 18. And we've got a choice between 4-betting and calling. Now, as you saw on the sticky a moment ago, I'll bring it back. There's a couple of things to consider. And I want to talk about a variety of opponents in different situations where I would choose to 4-bet and when I would choose to call this. And really, my willingness to 4-bet here depends on two things. One is stack depth, and the other is opponent 3-betting range. The deeper you are, the more you should lean towards calling. And the main reason for that is because when you're deeper, you're not just winning pots based off of flopping something good and getting it in, right? When you're deeper, you have the opportunity to win pots by value betting thinner, by bluffing flops that you miss, and there's just more ways for you to win the pot. So when you 4-bet and you're in position, you kind of surrender a little bit of your ability to win just by sheer skill post-flop, which means a lot when you're playing a weaker opponent here. So, the deeper I am, the more I just, lean towards calling. And another benefit of calling is that on, ace-high boards, king-high boards, boards that actually connect well with this hand, those are the boards that are c-bet also with the highest frequency from people who 3-bet out of position. So it's nice you can kind of guarantee that you capture a c-bet and win more money that way. But the shallower I am, or the shallower effective stacks are, the more likely I am to 4-bet a hand like this. Um, and that's because of like basically, if I'm considering four betting someone, they're gonna have a pretty wide range. So against a wide range, Ace King Jack X plays pretty well. The money in re-raised pots is won by dominating combo draws and made hands, as I've said before. So, when it comes Jack XX, King XX, and stuff like that, like, you're going to be dominating a lot of like worse Jack X or King X hands. So that's important. Um, so yeah, again, that's the main point to take home. Shorter we are, the more comfortable I am for betting this. Deeper I am, the more I'm going to be calling. Second thing to consider, and I would say more important even than stack depth, is who we're playing against. Like look at this guy here. He's a 71-47. He's just absolutely like going off. I mean, he's definitely a maniac. And what's actually something that looking back at his stats here, I hadn't noticed this before, but he's extremely aggressive preflop. Look at this, 71-47, 3-bet 42. But actually, like this number here, this is his aggression factor, and it's only 1. So how I would interpret this data is that he's like extremely aggressive pre-flop, but he's pretty passive post-flop. So that, especially when you're deeper like that, and you're in position, that might be a stat that I would interpret that like I should be calling more in position rather than 4-betting. But here, since he's shorter, I decided to 4-bet. And I don't think it's really that close. And again, like something that I really look at is like just how aggressive they are. And players who are 3-betting like more than 25%, like I'm pretty comfortable 4-betting this Ace King Jack 7 hand just for value. Now, something that's important to point out is that if I had Ace Queen Jack 7, I actually probably would just call. And it's a subtle difference in hand value, but it actually makes a big difference in terms of blockers when you're like the likelihood that you run into a pocket kings type hand is a lot lower when we have a king in our hand. So that's nice. Yeah, so that was basically what I really wanted to point out, is when we're facing a situation when we're thinking about 4-betting or calling, you want to analyze, whether you're in position, whether you're out of position, what the stack depth is like, and who the opponent is. In general, when I'm in position, I'm much more likely to call, but yeah, especially with this hand. Like, I used to have the league of like always 4-betting this, but now I tend to call a lot more. But here, I would definitely 4-bet because he's so aggressive. And we actually do 4-bet. He does call. Opponent jams. Flop top 2, but we lose to the nut flush. So, post flop is very standard, but you can kind of see it's nice that we ended up having his rundown dominated with our Ace King Jack. So made a good light 4-bet, but didn't end up winning the hand. Okay, I included this next one because I think it's an interesting spot, and also this situation in general is a pretty common spot, and I think a lot of low stakes, mid stakes, and even high stakes guys, I think, have pretty big leaks in this situation, so I figured we could go over it. So I open from middle position for pot with a nice hand, Jack 10-9-7 double suited. Button calls, looks like a very weak player, and we get squeezed by a reg from the big blind. And again, now let me bring up my little sticky note here. Okay, so let's look at his stats. Like, they're nothing special, right? This is your average reg stats at like low and mid stakes right now. 25-19, aggression frequency of 4. He's 3-betting 7% overall. So like this is, there's nothing really special about this guy through 500 hands, right? Let's look at his squeeze. I mean, 6% squeeze. So he's taking he's got a little bit wider squeeze than just simply like the strongest aces and strongest kings. He might take like a good squeeze spot when button opens, like someone calls in the small, like that's where he's going to put his light squeezes in. So seriously, there's nothing special about this guy. But what is special about this hand? Well, someone with these kind of stats is clearly like a competent reg, and he sees what I see. He sees that an aggressive regular open from middle position and a fish called on the button, right? So this is going to be a spot where someone has definitely got light squeezes in their range. And when I say light squeezes, I mean really light squeezes. He could just think that like I'm folding a lot, especially maybe like my fold to 3-bet is higher than another player. I don't know, but regardless, like this is in general a good squeeze spot for someone who's paying attention. Now, that's why I bring it up. It's important to pay attention to table dynamics. Depending on what your image is and who the caller is, competent players' squeezing ranges will change dramatically. And I wrote here, like, it's important to look for good opportunities to say fuck you to other regs, without getting it in too bad. The key to, like, in shorthanded poker is to appear like as loose and aggressive as possible, but for cheaply. You don't have to like spew stacks to prove your willingness to gamble, but it's important to let other players know that playing back at you comes with a price. And I think that this is actually something that's very important in shorthanded poker. The game's changing very rapidly. There's a lot of information that's available out there, and as that continues to happen, other players are constantly looking at the other ones who know that kind of information. So it's important to like fight back against other people and make them back off of you. So, coupled with the fact that I think it's pretty clear that this is a good squeeze spot for this player, not to mention the fact that Jack 10, 9, 7 double suited in the case that we do end up getting in it against aces, like it's a slight underdog, but it's not the worst. I decided to actually 4-bet. Now, I brought up something earlier that I said that a lot of players have a certain leak where they, like a big leak that players have is just basically calling with too wide of a range here. If you find yourself calling here with like an ace 6, 5, 4 nut suit type hand, and when I say calling here, I mean in any situation where you have the poorest relative position post flop in terms of like you're next to the squeezer and there's someone calling behind you, that's a big leak. If you're gonna play tight to 3-bets, that's the tight. If you're gonna if you're looking for spots to play like tight to 3-bets, that's where you should do it. Is when you have poor relative position post flop. You don't have a hand that's like capable of 4-betting, but you're gonna like just always fold when you miss, but you're gonna like jam when you flop something really good. Do you know what kind of hands I'm talking about? I'm trying to think of a specific hand. I'm talking like maybe like a king queen like 9-7 with a queen high suit. Like let's say you open that from the cutoff and the button called and the same guy squeezed from the big. Like that would be a really clear fold because again, like you're gonna flop a lot of like dominated one pair type stuff, and then when you do flop something really good, a lot of times you're gonna have to just like jam over a c-bet to protect it, to push out the other player. And in general, I've given you the rule of thumb pre-flop in other videos, but in general, like if you're trying to gauge the profitability of any pre-flop decision, any situation where you're pretty much just calling to hit without any chance, without any plan, or a very low chance of winning the pot when you miss, it's probably negative EV to call pre-flop. In most cases, like unless you have a good hand pre-flop that's like nice and smooth like this, that flops often enough, you really need to actually like bluff sometimes post-flop in order to make your call pre-flop good. So keep that in mind. But here, like we decided to 4-bet. And he called. I also, in the moment, I actually thought it was possible that he would fold, because if someone really is taking these kind of spots, they are gonna have some pretty weak shit. So in order, and they might actually end up folding. So, or another good outcome of this is that, we get it in. I guess that's not a great outcome, but he kind of sees that we're willing to get in there with him, and we're not gonna let him like take these spots. Or another outcome is actually that he calls pre-flop, and he like check folds when it comes deuce 4 or like some other kind of static flop that just misses high cards, because it's clear now when someone 3-bets and calls that they just have high cards. Of course they never have aces. Of course we like flop a wrap with our 9th and jack. We go all in. He calls and he backdoors a flush. So what do I have to say about his squeeze and then call of my 4-bet preflop? Well, it's pretty much the worst, honestly. I don't normally say that about people, but this is like pretty bad. How fortunate is he that I actually did have a light 4-bet in my range that was this exact hand. I mean, I would have 4-bet a lot lighter stuff than this. I would have definitely 4-bet like. And you know what's actually ironic is that I might have called. Let's say I had a hand like Ace King Queen Jack double suited, or like Ace King 10 Jack double suited. I certainly would actually consider calling there to keep in this guy's really terrible hands. So his call pre-flop of my 4-bet has got to be terrible. I really should have aces here a lot. I could easily have like good kings, just stuff that he's like doing terribly against. And how good is his squeeze pre? Even if it is a good squeeze spot, I actually think I would just prefer calling and donking, or like calling and check raising, than actually squeezing something like this. Anyhow, let's move on to the next hand. Okay. Here's a hand that again like highlights a pretty common situation. So we open Ace Queen 10 Deuce with a nut suit from the cutoff. The button calls, and a guy who's extremely short. He only has like 8.5 bigs. Goes all in from the small. Big blind folds, and we have a decision whether to call or 4-bet. Now, I just kind of wanted to bring this up because, again, like it's common enough. But, again, like analyzing the player types, we could see that the button, he's like got really reggy stats. He seems like an aggressive reg, I would categorize him as. We got 3 overall aggression factor. He's 3-betting 10%, 28-20. Maybe actually in this session he's playing a little more aggressive. I guess it's only 15 hands, but, he's been loose and getting in there, and you can kind of assume like 28-20 overall. He's gonna be more like a 35-30 when it's 4-handed. Benefits to calling would be that we keep in what's likely a loose button range. Negatives of calling are that we're unlikely to have a strong hand when we call here, and we open up the opportunity for the button to stick in a light 4-bet, or also play a hand in position when our hand is kind of face up. And frankly, and that's why I wrote here, good players are going to wisely put in a light 4-bet, so it's important to raise to isolate, even though we are likely ahead of his button peeling range to protect ourselves. And when I say we're ahead of his button range, I mean it's really not like a massive equity advantage either. If he has almost anything, it's at best we're 55-45 or 60-40. So it's not like our hand is a monster enough to call to induce a light peel. Maybe if we had something, actually I would almost 4-bet anything, frankly. I just think that against someone who's competent, clearly competent, it's pretty tough to play these pots out of position. So with the dead money out there, I'd prefer to just raise for value and get it heads up. And again, the reason I included this hand was to show you sort of how your ranges are perceived. Now, if you're playing people who are more aggressive, it's kind of cool to have slow plays in your range. If you somehow, if you have weak aces, for example, this is an okay spot to just call so that they can put in the light 4-bet for you, and then you could of course just get all in out of position with your weak aces. But as it was played, we 4-bet and he called, and we got all in and he called, and ended up running out 2 pair. And we can see his hand here. This is another hand that I think a lot of players overvalue. Queen Jack 7-9 is certainly a good hand, but it's a good hand in the right situations. It's not a good hand against people who are capable of putting in light 4-bets, for example. This is a much better hand again, back in the day when people were only 4-betting aces. But nowadays, a lot of players are 4-betting a lot of kings types hands, a lot of ace, king, jack type hands, and this hand plays pretty terribly against that. So, how good is this call? I don't think it's the best. I can't. It's probably slightly plus EV, slightly negative EV, or break even-ish. But just remember, these hands, and really any hand in general, how profitable they are always about what kind of range you're against. All right. This is another situation that, of course, comes up all the time in 6max that we should definitely talk about. So the button opens to 3x, and He seems kind of loose and bad. I mean, anybody who has stats like this at these stakes, I typically kind of assume that they're just loose and bad. It is possible to have this big of a differential between, he's like a 46-24. Anyone who has, I don't know, more than like a 5 to, I would say like more than a 7 to 10 difference between their VPIP and their PFR, I usually like start to get a little suspicious about how wide they are pre. But I'm not saying that this style is like 100% never profitable, but in general, I think that's a pretty safe bet. Is that someone who's this loose pre, is probably not like a great player, or maybe they do some things well, but they've got a pre-flop leak by seeing too many flops, and so that player opens on the button, and this player 3-bets from the small, and this could usually be it could be pretty wide depending on what he thinks of the button opener. But in general, like this guy, he seems, it's like 6,000 hands. He's probably like at least competent. So he could, yeah, like I said, he could have a pretty wide range. We decided 4-bet, which of course is standard. There is some people who would want to know why we can't just call because we don't have great aces. But the argument against that is that we won't have position post flop if we just call. And I think that, I've already talked about the disadvantages of playing with poor relative position. It's really difficult to do. So I'd prefer to play in position with an equity advantage than with poor relative position with like a small equity advantage against 2 other players. So that's why it's good to 4-bet. So we do. They both call. It comes 995 rainbow. All right, so this happens all the time, and this is like a really uncomfortable situation for really anyone, like including myself. Like I hate these spots. You have like a good pre-flop hand, and you have the opportunity to put in a big re-raise pre-flop, but then like this flop comes, and you want to avoid like getting in bad, but you also don't want to make yourself vulnerable to your opponent bluffing you off the pot because it's like a scary board. And it's clear that your hand is well defined, but you don't want to make yourself vulnerable to a bluff. So what do? What's the best line? Well, there's a couple of things to consider, okay? The first one is that there's a big difference between the frequency in which you run into trips. And it depends on the ranking of the board pair. So like, something like 997 or like 995 in this case is a lot different than like 4-4 deuce, of course, and I think that goes without mentioning. Be wary of like Jack X boards in 4-bet pots, or 10-10 X boards. Those are the boards where you run into trips the most. Other than like an Ace X board, those are the boards that people play the most. Is Jack 10X combos. People love those like straight completing or like straight making cards in 3 and 4-bet pots. So beware of those boards. But otherwise, like a 6-6 deuce board. Well, of course we have a 6 here, but I'm saying in general, like those boards are fine. And a lot of times, like especially if I'm playing someone who's aggressive, I actually will try to induce bluffs on those boards or induce light floats by picking smaller sizings. And there's also like a really big difference between heads up and multi-way pots. I've spent some time like putting the frequencies into Poker Juice about how often I actually do run into trips on these boards. Especially if you're in like a downswing, or you play a few re-raised pots in a row where it seems like you keep running into the nuts. That's where poker analytics software kind of comes in handy. You can kind of keep yourself in check. You can say like, oh man, like Jesus, it seems like I'm just sort of running into these hands all the time. Like, maybe I'm choosing the wrong hands to 3-bet, or maybe I should just be like checking, giving up on these boards more often. And it helps you pair numbers with actual situations that happen at the table. And what I found is that for boards like this, or the more commonly the boards that like more commonly connect with opponents, so like I said, like the 10-10x, 9-9x, Jack X boards of the world, for each player in the pot, like, is about 20% for each player. So like you could expect to run into, especially in like a 4-bet pot here, you're probably gonna run into a 9 like anywhere from 40 to 50% of the time. Now, whether or not you're going to get bluffed on these boards is a different story, right? So the biggest mistake you could make, when I say these boards, I'm talking about really like any static board. So even if this was like 9-5 deuce monotone and we didn't have, any flush blocker, like I would consider that to be a static board. The biggest mistake you can make is to like, put in some dead money and then give up on it just because you like didn't know what to do. So I like to kind of decide whether I'm going to bet call or bet fold before I actually put any more money into the pot. And what that means is that if I was playing someone who was like on the more passive side, I would kind of have my mind made up whether I was going to bet fold or bet call. Before like kind of just like betting because I didn't know what else to do, and then being like, oh shit, he's all in, like, do I call now? So my best advice is that small bets are effective, but beware of inducing without knowing how your opponents are going to respond, or like how you're going to respond to small bets. So a common mistake I see is that players misuse like small bets, maybe like their opponent checks, and they bet 18, or like they bet like 21 here, and then their opponent jams, and then they fold when they have this hand, and then they kind of wonder if they like made a bad bet fold, if they made a bad bet call. My advice is make up your mind before your opponent acts, kind of like know how you're going to respond to each of his actions, and you'll be a lot better off. Secondly, like if you are trying to always on these boards, it's the most important to take the line that your opponent thinks is the opposite of what you have, basically, depending on, of course, like what you're trying to encourage from your opponent. So like if you're trying to get him to stack off wider on these boards, if you're trying to get him to stick it in with like kings, or you're trying to like induce a bluff, make sure to like, take a line that that is consistent with you bluffing. So I see a lot of players, for example, they'll just pot it here because they kind of like, they don't really know what else to do, so they just kind of go all in. But of course, like you would never take that line really with a bluff. So make sure you keep that in mind, okay? So, in the actual hand, like we decided to just check and evaluate. And how which line that I take, I think really depends on which where I'm at in the relative position triangle here, right? So it's kind of cool here because I have this like short stack behind me, and I think that like if he checks most of the time, he's probably doesn't have a 9, and I also know that this player seems like he has aggressive tendencies, so I could like potentially peel one off and get him to bluff, and it really is like a way ahead or way behind situation. So the worst option would be to just like go all in, which again, like I said, I see players do, but it's not like someone with kings usually just makes a disciplined fold, usually. If they're bad enough, sometimes they'll call it off, but against, like, it's pretty unlikely. I think that if I just jam here, that if I get called, certainly in more than one spot, but in one spot I am likely beat. So like if I was to bet small, if I bet small here, I would typically like be betting small for the purpose of calling it off, not for folding, I don't think. Against the button, I would bet small and call. Well, it's close, but I think checking is okay. But that's something to think about in that three-way post-flop situation. So the button jams, obviously small blind rejams, we fold, and we have a situation where the button had kings, and the small blind had a 9. So pretty standard. What do I think about the buttons play? It's not great. I don't like it. It's again like a way ahead or way behind situation. He probably could have, he could have chosen a better sizing than just jamming it in there. So, yeah, I think that's a good place to stop for today. Let's, of course, as always, if you guys have any feedback for me, please leave it in the comment section. And let me know what you'd like to talk about next time, or if you want to go back to a live play video review. This is John Beaupre, aka Casino Crime. Thanks for checking out the video, guys. Good luck.